Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome and stand as we begin worship here tonight. Hope you are able to enjoy some good food and fellowship, and look forward to hearing from Dr. Kindell here tonight. And then begin with worship songs and just set our minds on the Lord here tonight. So, Lord, we thank you for this time. Thank you for the blessing of coming together before you and to praise you, Lord. So would you just lift our eyes to you here and bless this time that we have tonight. In Jesus' name, amen. Strength will rise as we wait upon the Lord. Wait upon the Lord. We will wait upon the Lord. Strength will rise as we wait upon the Lord. Wait upon the Lord. We will wait upon the Lord our God. You reign forever. Our hope, our strong deliverer. You are the everlasting God, the everlasting God. You do not faint, you won't grow weary. Strength will rise, and strength will rise as we wait upon the Lord. Wait upon the Lord, we will wait upon the Lord. And strength will rise as we wait upon the Lord. Wait upon the Lord, we will wait upon the Lord our God. You reign forever. Our hope, our strong deliverer. You are the everlasting God, the everlasting God. You do not faint, you won't grow weary. You're the defender of the weak. You comfort those in need. You lift us up on wings like eagles. Our God, you reign forever. Our hope, our strong deliverer. You are the everlasting God, the everlasting God. You do not faint, you won't ever be. How marvelous, how wonderful is my Savior's love for me. He took my sins and my sorrows, He made them His very own. He bore the burden to Calvary and suffered and died alone. And sing how marvelous, how wonderful, and my song shall ever be. How marvelous, how wonderful is my Savior's love for me. Sing how marvelous, how wonderful, and my song shall ever be. How marvelous, how wonderful is my Savior's love for me. When the ransom in glory, His face I at last shall see, 'twill be my joy through the ages to sing of His love for me, singing how marvelous, how wonderful, and my song shall ever be. How marvelous, how wonderful is my Savior's love for me. Singing how marvelous, how wonderful, and my song shall ever be. How marvelous, how wonderful is my Savior's love for me. How marvelous, how wonderful is my Savior's love for me. Is my Savior's love for me. Oh Lord, how we thank you for your love, that's everlasting love and a perfecting love, and you desire to change us from the inside out. And so, Lord, as we've come here to hear even some of these evidences of, Lord, your creation, of your splendor, your majesty, Lord, would we be in awe of you and of your glory, and just that you are high above us, Lord. Your ways are not our ways. And so we can be confident in you. Thank you that we serve a great and awesome God. So we bless your name and thank you. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. Well, take a minute and say hello to somebody next to you. Alrighty. Hate to break up all the conversation, but I'm gonna. So we're blessed to have Dr. Kindell with us again. I think he was here a year ago, and I think it was about the resurrection, right? And so he had called and was going to be in the area, or general area anyway. West is miles don't seem to affect people traveling long distances as much as other places. But so we're blessed with to be able to have him here tonight. As Pastor Ted is gone and still in India, along with a couple other brothers, and so continue to pray for them. We'd appreciate just especially for their protection and that they'd be able to make it home safely. Wouldn't have any hiccups, just plane wise, or any flights being canceled or re-entry issues that way. So continue to keep them in your prayers. They're supposed to be home Sunday night, I believe, and so we appreciate your prayers for them, and just know that they've had a blessed time so far and really enjoyed their time at the Bible College in India, and the Lord was working and using them, and so we're blessed to be able to send them and see how the Lord uses that in the future as well. So we're gonna kind of cut right to it, and so Dr. Kindell is gonna share with us about soft tissue in dinosaurs, and so it's gonna be a lot of really good information, and hopefully you're encouraged in your faith, and what a mighty God that we do serve, and He's created us intricately, and we see evidences of it all over the place, and so we're blessed to have him with us. So let's welcome Dr. Kindell.
Okay, I've got a lot to cover tonight and not a whole lot of time to do it, so we're going to get right into it. No Bible puns tonight, sorry. Oh, I know, but life is hard. If we can get the PowerPoint up and perhaps bring down some of these stage lights so we can see the screen a little bit better. But tonight we're going to be talking about a subject that is very germane to this area of Bozeman, Montana, because some of the groundbreaking research that I will be talking about tonight was actually done right here at Montana State University and somewhat at the Museum of the Rockies with Jack Horner. Anybody ever hear of him? Very famous dinosaur scientist, used to be around here, and his graduate student who was working under him at the time, who is now a doctor in paleontology, Mary Schweitzer. So the question is, are dinosaur bones relatively young? By that I mean just several thousand years old rather than multiple scores of millions. The evolutionists claim that dinosaurs are at least 65 million to up to 220 million years old. But as we shall see, the evidence within their own bones cries out a very different story. So the evidence seems to show that soft tissue, proteins, and carbon-14 indicates that yes, they are just several thousands of years old, which would correspond literally with the revelation of God in Genesis, that the Genesis global flood was only about 4,500 to 5,000 years ago at the most. And to that short time scale, it is indeed possible, in spite of the second law of thermodynamics, in spite of pulverization by alpha decay and ground radiation, these things could still be as beautifully intact as we find them. Now, how many of you have heard of soft tissue in dinosaur bones before? Well, you've heard about it tonight, haven't you? Okay. Surprisingly, when you ask this to students in secular universities, a lot of them have not heard. In fact, even graduate students in paleontology said, I never heard of it. Well, why is that? Because the evolutionists, frankly, are uncomfortable with it. They claim to have evidence that it could last that long, but they don't seem to be that confident in their own claims because they don't like it to get out. Now, if they want to make a big deal about something, they do. I don't know if you remember back in the 1990s, we had a supposed Martian rock in which they found supposed fossil evidence of bacteria. And this was such a big whoop-de-doo for quite a while back then. This, of course, was very politically correct because evolution is supposed to happen on any suitable planet, and we don't need God, a creator, so it could have evolved on Mars just like it evolved on Earth without needing a creator to be involved at all. Well, they said this looks like a certain type of bacteria, but analysis showed it's about 100 times smaller than the smallest known bacteria. It does not have enough spatial capacity to even have the biochemical machinery required for the life processes. Plus, it's just a crystalline form of polyaromatic hydrocarbons, and not of the type that are produced as a byproduct of biological metabolism. It's actually the kind that can be produced by non-biological chemical processes. So if you look on the internet today, hardly anybody gives this the time of day because it's not significant at all. But it goes to show when they want to make a big deal in the media about something, they certainly will do it. They're not doing it with dinosaur soft tissue, even though they claim to have a reason how it could survive so long. But even the president back at the time, Bill Clinton, always a good guy to quote, he said, if this discovery is confirmed, it would surely be one of the most stunning insights into our universe that science has discovered. Well, it turned out to be nothing. Flash in the pan. Excuse me. Now again, Dr. Mary Schweitzer, who is now a PhD in paleontology and had been here in Bozeman, she now is a paleontologist at North Carolina State University. But what happened was they found a T-Rex femur in the Elk Creek Formation here in the state of Montana, and it was so big that after they put wrappings on it to help preserve it in transport, they found out it was too heavy for the helicopter to lift. So they had to do something they rarely do. They broke it in two, so they could take it out in pieces. Some of the smaller pieces and shards, they said, why don't we look at these? It's rare, to look in dinosaur bones. They usually don't break them. And so Mary Schweitzer began to look at it under the microscope, and she was shocked and stunned to find what looked like blood vessels with red blood cells in them, things that looked like from a modern bone, like a bone that was not very old at all. So she published for the first time good high-quality, high-resolution color photography. And this had been, hinted at a couple of times before in the 60s and 70s, but with the black and white photography they had back then didn't catch much attention. When this got published, it started a big firestorm because there is no good reason why these should be in such good condition if they are a minimum of 65 million years old. So she herself, Mary Schweitzer, said she got goosebumps. It was exactly like looking, quote, it was exactly like looking at a slice of modern bone. But of course, I couldn't believe it. The bones, after all, are 65 million years old. How could blood cells survive that long? Good question, because based on everything we know in the second law of thermodynamics and ground radiation, it should only have survived a maximum under ideal conditions of only a few 100,000 years. And there's good experiments to show that that makes sense. Now, she herself is a professing Christian, but she's a theistic evolutionist, apparently. Someone who believes that God used millions of years of evolution as his creative process. So she believes these are millions of years old. This was against her belief. She didn't like it. So she did 17 tests to try to disprove it, 17 times, and all the tests came back positive. So after that, she said, oh my goodness, this is real. So she went to her mentor, this scientist, Jack Horner, the famous dinosaur scientist that used to be here, and she said, look, I found this, I've checked it 17 different times, it's real, I want you to look at it in the microscope. And when he looked at it in the microscope, the first words out of his mouth were an expletive, which I will not directly quote, but then he said, the creationists are just going to love you. See, he understood exactly what this meant. We've done decades of research on how fast certain proteins like collagen break down thermodynamically. And all of them indicated that they can only last a few 100,000 years. But that was done by archaeologists who are examining remains that everybody believes is only a few thousand years old. So it's not a problem. It's a big problem when you find them in things that are supposed to be scores of millions of years old. Then you've gone beyond what the second law of thermodynamics says can be possible. So Discover magazine, and this is the online version that you read on the internet, it said, when this shy paleontologist, referring to Mary Schweitzer, found soft, fresh-looking tissue inside a T-Rex femur, she erased a line between past and present. Then all hell broke loose. Why? Because this is challenging their most fervent, cherished theory that gets rid of God, evolution. If evolution is true, we don't need to believe in a creator. We can be our own God, make up our own morality, do whatever we want, and we don't face judgment for our selfishness and sin at the end of our life, because there is no righteous God who created us in the first place. But all hell broke loose because the powers of hell, Satan and his demons, have been very happy to have the most successful lie in the history of the world, and that's evolution. It's believed by more people, more billions of people on this planet, both outside and to some extent inside the church, than any other lie he's ever spawned. And here we have evidence that is powerfully coming against that. No wonder they got upset, and all hell broke loose. Now, Discovery Magazine article again on the internet said, he says the cellular material, and this is quoting the evolutionist expert by the name of Beta, he says the cellular material Schweitzer found must be contamination from outside sources. Even if the T-Rex had died in a colder, drier climate than Hell Creek, environmental radiation would have degraded its body. Beta says, quote, bones absorb uranium and thorium like crazy. You've got an internal dose that will wipe out biomolecules. What are all the indications? Within a few 100,000 years, max, not even 1 million years. Now, he knew what he was talking about. He let the cat out of the bag. Not just thermodynamics, but bombardment by alpha ground radiation should have reduced this to dust with no tissue, no cellular structure, no proteins in just a few 100,000 years. It's interesting that this comment was soon deleted after he made it. Did anybody guess why? Because they didn't want anybody to know that this is a problem that none of them have an answer for. All of their arguments have been, well, we think we can make it tougher by introducing chemicals that made it tough enough so it wouldn't break down thermodynamically quite as fast and maybe could last millions of years. Nobody has an answer to this. Nobody. Now, they attacked her, of course. Hell broke loose. They attacked her. And even though she believed in an old Earth, they said, you didn't follow the proper protocol. You didn't jump through the hoops to rule out the possibility of modern contamination. You must have had modern contaminants get in there because this can't be indigenous, soft tissue, cell structure, and proteins in ancient dinosaur bones. So she said, okay, I'll take that challenge and I'll do research on a different species of dinosaur, a hadrosaur, which means a duck-billed dinosaur. And she did it on a hadrosaur femur. Okay, now that's what a hadrosaur femur looks like. This is not the one she did it on. But she jumped through all the hoops, she did all the proper protocol, she ruled out contamination, and she found exactly the same evidence in this species of dinosaur, which, by the way, was supposed to be 10 million years older than the T-Rex. The T-Rex they claimed was 70 million years, this supposedly 80 million years old, but it still has the soft tissue, blood cells, cell structure, and lots of proteins. So she published this, and the evidence was so strong that more than a dozen other evolutionist scientists co-authored it with her. And it was published in the prestigious Science magazine, official publication of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. It doesn't get any better than that. Yet all these evolutionists signed on and co-authored it with her, and the title was Biomolecular Characterization and Protein Sequences of the Campion Hadrosaur, which means duck-billed dinosaur, the name being B. canadensis. So that ruled out contamination. So now they've got, oh my gosh, we don't want to believe it's real. What else could it possibly be? So some scientists said, perhaps it's just biofilms, this kind of sludge or film that's left over after bacterial infestation. If bacteria were able to get into it in recent times, they would leave this kind of scum called biofilm. The problem with that is that it doesn't look like red blood cells, nucleated red blood cells, blood vessels. It doesn't look, like cell structure. It is just, this kind of film. And its biochemical composition is all wrong. It's primarily polysaccharides. In other words, sugars bonded together, whereas proteins are amino acids bonded together. So not only in its appearance, it does not look like what we have found in the dinosaur bones. It often looks kind of globular and bulbous, does not look like red blood cells, does not look like blood vessels, doesn't look like osteocyte cells. These are osteocytes, cells from bones. Notice they have these little delicate filaments coming out of them called filopodia, which means literally thread feet. This doesn't look like that, and the biochemical composition is all wrong. So you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out that can't be a legitimate explanation. So we not only have that, we have all kinds of other proteins and tissues that have been found. Not only red blood cells in the blood vessels, but also soft, stretchy tissue, hemoglobin, bone structures, including the osteocyte cells, ovalbumin, interesting protein. It's unique to eggshells, and they've actually found it intact in dinosaur eggshells. How in the world did it survive? And it's certainly not something that would come from bacterial films. Now, chitin is a biochemical compound that doesn't have amino acids. It's a polysaccharide. In other words, sugars bonded together rather than amino acids. But it's a different kind of structure than we have in the biofilms. And also, we have found bone that's 100% virgin bone, no encroachment of minerals. It's supposed to have been in the rocks for many, many millions of years, but no mineral encroachment. That might be conceivable on a time scale of several thousand years, but certainly not millions and millions. We find a very tough protein, bone collagen, and we found a lot of that. Skin with the proteins intact, including skin pigmentation agent protein known as melanin. Complex FEX proteins, we found fragments of DNA, which even on the biblical time scale, you would not expect more than fragments. DNA is much more susceptible to thermodynamic breakdown because of its structure. Therefore, it decays 500% faster than proteins. But we would expect to find at least fragments, and Mary Schweitzer reported that she did find that, as well as certain types of proteins associated with DNA called histones, and a very tough protein that you have in your hair and your fingernails, keratin, and soft, stretchy tissue. You have the forceps here pulling on it. This was from a video. You actually see it stretches like it's rubber because it has a lot of proteins in it called elastin. And as the name implies, it gives the elastic characteristics to these soft tissues. And there are several other proteins that have been found as well. None of this is like biofilms, not even close. So she published here in the PLOS One Science magazine, and the title was Testing the Hypothesis of Biofilm as a Source for Soft Tissue and Cell-like Structures Preserved in Dinosaur Bone. She had two other evolutionists co-author it with it. This definitively struck down the idea that it could be biofilms. So that has been wiped out too. After that, a lot of other scientists got on the bandwagon and they said, yeah, this is ridiculous. Bacterial biofilms can't begin to explain what we've been finding. It must be genuine. Then, if it's genuine, you've got to figure out how in the world it could last so long when there are strong scientific physical arguments and experiments that say outright it can't last that long. One last clutching at a straw, so to speak, is the Maillard reactions that some fossils have been subjected to. If they get heated, perhaps by volcanic sources, and they're heated for a while at 250 to say 360 some degrees, then they actually get brown. It's like when you put a piece of toast in the toaster, that heat reacts with the biochemicals in the bread and makes it brown. That's a Maillard reaction. So it's also called the toast model, okay? The problem is almost all the published data doesn't have any evidence of overheating or toasting having been present. So it can't be the explanation because it's simply not there in most of the specimens that have been published on. Furthermore, just because you toast it, how in the world does that make it miraculously immune to the effect of the second law of thermodynamics? Now, the second law of thermodynamics states that with time, all complex structures go from complexity to simplicity or from order to disorder. It's an inexorable law. All you need is time. The question is, based on the experiments, how long does it take? And all the experiments show it should only take several hundreds of thousands of years. When they're in this good a shape, it appears to be only a few thousand years old. So the toast model, I would say, is toast. Okay. All right. Now, soft tissue found inside a dinosaur bone, and this subtitle, The Scientific Saga of Mary Schweitzer and Her Discovery of Soft Tissue Inside a Dinosaur Bone. And this is a little YouTube episode that you can look up yourself, but I put some excerpts from it here because it really summarizes the current status of the evolutionary scientific community of what they're saying about soft tissue in dinosaur bones. So when she found this, she said, well, there's three major possibilities. The fossil might be young, at least she said that. You know, that is definitely a real possibility. Secondly, the soft tissue could be just biofilm, as we've seen that's been ruled out. And the third possibility, there might be a previously unknown preservation process. Of course, that's the one that they prefer to go for. Now, they also said, well, even if we can't explain soft tissue, it's a little fly in the ointment, it's just a gadfly. It's not important. We have all this massive evidence for evolution, supposedly. But really, this is the tip of an iceberg. It's shining light like a smoking gun that all this supposed data really isn't cracked up to what it's supposed to be. That there are fatal cracks and flaws in their theory, and this is just shining a light on that. If they can't explain this, then maybe all these assumptions they make over here aren't all that good either, as we shall see. So she went through the list. First, she put a question mark behind the fossil might be young. Being an old Earth Christian, she believed, I don't want to believe that. I want to believe it's old, so she crossed that out. She said, I myself have proved they can't be bacterial films, so she crossed that out. Then she said there might be a previously unknown preservation process. So what she said is maybe there's chemicals that would be released after death that would cause cross-linking. That means that proteins would get additional welds or bonds more than they originally have. Now, a protein, a rough analogy, would be like a big long chain, and the amino acids are like the links in the chain, and they're chemically composed so that the head can link to the tail to the head. So a big long chain of usually around 400 some amino acids. And so you have that long chain, but if you can add extra bonds, extra links to the chain, the time it would take to break all those bonds over time would take longer because you have extra links or extra bonds that have to be broken. So she said if we could find something like, the chemicals that are used to tan cow leather, that, excuse me, that causes this cross-linking. It makes it much more tough and durable than it would have been otherwise. Not nearly durable enough, as we shall see. But that was the idea. So she said it might act something like formaldehyde. We've all seen that, in high school and college, biology. You've got these specimens in formaldehyde. Well, formaldehyde does in fact cause cross-links, and it does make it tougher. And of course, bacteria and things can't live in formaldehyde. It's a bactericide as well, so it helps preserve them. But can you put that in the ground and expect that the second law of thermodynamics and ground radiation will not destroy it? I don't think so. It doesn't add that many links to it. Now, here we have a rough picture of what a protein actually would look like. This looks like a rope, but actually if you imagine tiny little links in a chain, about 400 or more in this thing, that's what a protein is. And when you put it in formaldehyde, it adds maybe a dozen more cross links, as you can see here. That means more links to break if you want to break it down. But it's not that many more. It already has hundreds, and you're only adding maybe a dozen or two. That shouldn't be that significant. It does make cow leather a bit more robust, but it still can't overcome thermodynamics and ground radiation. So in looking in the microscope, she found something. She found microscopic crystals of iron. And she says, well, we know that iron can cause some cross-linking, not nearly as good as formaldehyde, but at least we have a cross-linking agent there. And so there was the answer, eureka! We have something that can make it tougher, therefore supposedly it can last for millions of years. So the observations they claimed was that iron cross-links proteins. That's true, but nobody's ever proven it cross-links as efficiently as formaldehyde, and even formaldehyde does not do it enough. Cross-linked proteins are extremely durable. Well, not that much compared to what they have to put up with. Iron is found in blood cells. Well, that's true. Iron is released from blood cells as they decay. Very important assumption she's making there. She says soon after the dinosaur dies, the red blood cells containing hemoglobin, which has iron in it, the cells would split open and release the hemoglobin with iron, and this would then saturate the tissues, and the cross-linking would make it tougher, so supposedly it would survive thermodynamic and ground radiation bombardment for supposedly millions of years. Also, she said, soft tissue in dinosaur bones is saturated with iron. Okay, well, not really. We found many examples where there's essentially no iron at all. And how can this be the answer if many cases there's no iron, either from the environment or from hemoglobin, and yet the tissues are beautifully preserved? One thing that would explain it in all those scenarios is not very old. So her hypothesis was that iron from blood helped preserve the tissue for millions of years. Well, I don't quite think so. Here we have a creationist scientist, Mark Armitage, and you can look this up on YouTube under the title, Can Iron Really Preserve Soft Tissue Over Millions of Years? And he points out that Weider's Functional Histology, a textbook, a latest edition of a textbook on histology and what kind of things cause cross-linking, he said they don't even list iron as being even significant. He said if it worked to preserve things for millions of years, somebody would have patented it already, and it would be used instead of formaldehyde. But he says, it does some cross-linking, but not nearly as good as formaldehyde, and that's why it's not used instead of formaldehyde. So he has many other arguments on there why iron would not be an adequate agent to cause it to last long enough. Now, ironically, Mary Schweitzer said when it dies, the red blood cells and the iron encased within those cellular membranes, the membranes split open and release the hemoglobin and the iron. Yet her own photographs say the opposite. Remember, these things are supposed to be a minimum of 65 million years old. How in the world long does it take for that membrane to split open? You see, when she did the tests, she artificially split them open by a process known as lysing, breaking open those cells. Apparently, it doesn't work in nature even after 65 plus million years. So if it's essential to release it, and she did it artificially, plus used filters, used centrifuges to concentrate the hemoglobin into a super concentrated hemoglobin, pure hemoglobin formula, which is more than you could ever expect in nature or in a dinosaur bone, and then she used that in the study. That's very unrealistic and used laboratory procedures that obviously could not have been done in an ancient dinosaur bone. But the most telling thing is that she says it's critical that soon after it dies, the cell membranes rupture and let the hemoglobin and iron out. But here her own photograph shows 65 million years plus, it hasn't broken open yet. Here also, now the arrows are pointing to actually blood vessels, but you can see the red blood cells with the red hemoglobin still in them after 70 some million years, supposedly. Here we see nucleated red blood cells within dinosaur bone. Notice the cell membranes have not ruptured yet. If you need it to release soon afterwards to saturate the tissue, but after 65 to 70 million years it hasn't released yet, there's a big problem there. And these are her own photographs, for crying out loud. Her own photographs bear testimony against her hypothesis that it can't be true. And you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure that out. Now, anybody know the name of this man? Dr. Hugh Ross. He is the founder of Reasons for Faith Ministries, which in my view, my opinion, is a misnomer. He has reasons to believe parts of the Bible, but certainly not parts of Genesis, especially the early chapters of Genesis. He is what we call a progressive creationist. He says he can't believe what Genesis says because he's a scientist. He has a PhD in astronomy. And he says we have to interpret it according to what secular history and science says. So he says God must have progressively created single-cell creatures, then marine invertebrates, fish, amphibians, reptiles, mammals, finally man, over many billions of years. In fact, he actually says, you can look at his website, that God created hominids, basically ape men, who had no soul and therefore could have no salvation, I guess because he had to experiment because he doesn't know what he was doing. And he created these ape men, let them live for a while, and then they went extinct, and then he created Adam and Eve. And I'd like to know where he got that idea. I don't think he got it out of Genesis. I think he got it somewhere else. But the point is, he is a Christian. He believes in Christ as Savior for his sins, and I'm glad for that. But he believes in an old earth, therefore he has attacked this as well, just like the evolutionists. So Dr. Hugh Ross said if a sample is isolated from any exposure to bacteria and oxygen, then the soft tissue evidence easily can be preserved for over 100 million years. Really, I don't think so. Now there's three major things that will break down faster than anything else. The first one, of course, is bacteria. If bacteria get access, they will eat up the biomaterials, eat them up, metabolize them, they're gone. And that can happen fairly fast. Oxygen, of course, is a corrosive agent. It will oxidize and destroy them. Another one is water. Water is called the universal solvent. So if water gets in there, it will break down even faster yet. But we're not talking real fast. It may take 100,000 years for water, by its hydrolytic effect to break down these tissues. But he's saying, well, under the right conditions, you exclude these things that break it down fast, it'll make it. But the experiments don't say so. See, he's saying, I'm a scientist, listen to me, I have authority as a scientist. That's actually a textbook fallacy of logic known as an appeal to authority, or argumentum ad authoritarium, an appeal to authority. The problem is all authorities and all scientists are human, all right? All humans are fallible. In fact, we can do a logical syllogistic reasoning to a valid conclusion. First premise, all scientists are human. Anybody disagree with that? Okay. Then secondly, all humans are fallible. Okay. Anybody disagree with that? Not to live long, no, that's true. All humans make mistakes. They're fallible. They have pride, prejudice, preconceived ideas that color how they look at the world. So, therefore, all scientists are fallible. Why? Because they are human. They are fallible. They have a dog in the fight. He has something he wants to believe in, and this is going against it, so he's attacking it. But he can't point to a single experiment that says it can easily be preserved. All the experiments done for decades by the archaeologists have shown, hey, it disappears, projected in just hundreds of thousands of years. Now, his colleague at Reasons for Faith Ministry is Dr. Fazl Rana. My hat's off to him. He actually got saved out of Islam, which is not easy to do. So good for him. I'm glad. But he got his mind brainwashed at secular university. So he also, although he has a PhD in biochemistry, he believes that the earth is billions of years old and the fossil record is many millions of years old. And so he had to attack this evidence also, even though he is claims to be a born-again Christian, which he could very well be. I'm not going to judge his salvation, but he attacks what the Bible literally says, and he wants to argue that it's old. Now, he wrote a book, therefore, called Dinosaur Blood and the Age of the Earth, where he basically reiterates what Mary Schweitzer and others have said about iron being able to make these things tougher so they could supposedly last for millions of years. Now, Dr. Rana said collagen, which is one of the toughest proteins, by the way, or at least fragments of it, could survive 68 million years in an environment devoid of water, oxygen, and microbes, given its structure. Okay? So, well, if you rule out these three things that break it down fast, then it could last a long time. That's not what the experiments show. Guess what? The experiments are done without water, oxygen, and microbes being present. Just by pure thermodynamics, the rate of breakdown is measured and extrapolated, and it only goes hundreds of thousands of years. And then you have on compounding on that background radiation in the rocks from little particles that were eroded out of igneous rocks into the sedimentary rock matrix, little particles of uranium and thorium that are all around it and bombarding it with alpha radiation, which can actually go through solid rock to some extent, and certainly would destroy soft biomaterials, again, with hundreds of thousands of years. So he's saying this. Hey, I'm a PhD in biochemistry, listen to me. I say point to one experiment that proves it, because science isn't somebody's opinion, it's what you can prove by experiment to be true. Notice they don't cite experiments. They just say, trust me, I'm a scientist. All scientists are fallible because they're human. Now, here we have electron scanning micrograph of what collagen proteins. Now, bone collagen is one of the strongest proteins. Most all other proteins are not nearly as strong. One of the reasons is because you have three different protein polymers, amino acids, actually like three different chains of protein that are then wound together. Like it says in the scripture, a rope of three cords is not easily broken. Well, God decided to make a very strong protein, so he took three different proteins, wound them together like a rope. In addition to that, there are additional cross links all along this rope. So you not only have all the bonds, all the links of the chain in three different proteins that are wound together, you have additional cross links all along the body of it. It's designed to be extremely strong and have immense amount of links. This is much stronger than any other protein, practically, that you would put in formaldehyde. Something put in formaldehyde wouldn't have near as many links as this already has. So if this can't survive, even if blood cross-linked these proteins, even if formaldehyde did it, it still wouldn't be as tough as this. And this is the one that's been most largely studied by Buckley and Collins, some of the greatest British researchers in this field of measuring how long it takes for proteins to break down. And they've said, about 450,000 years on the average, even for the strong one. Now then, so we have a regular protein, yet a dozen or so cross links. It's not that significant. Collagen has a lot more than that, and therefore all these other proteins would have broken down even faster than collagen. Now another thing, they say, well, maybe if it was an Arctic permafrost, that slows down the thermodynamic decay, and that's true. Things decay more rapidly at high temperature than they do at low temperature. But it's not significant, because even those that are found in Arctic regions, which aren't that much, most of them are found in the temperate zone, all those red dots, place where you found dinosaurs. Even if you have an Arctic permafrost, you might get 1 to 3 million years at the most, even with those sub-freezing temperatures. And it would have to be that way for millions of years. We know that's not the case for those in the temperate zone. At just 50 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 degrees Celsius, the breakdown indicates by the experiments just a few 100,000 years. Now, the Creation Research Society, of which I'm a lifetime sustaining member, they decided we needed to do some original research precisely because people like Mary Schweitzer said, well, these young Earth creationists have hijacked my research. It's my research, I did it, they don't know everything about it. They're critiquing my research and they don't have a right to do that. And there's a little bit of validity to that. So we said we need to get our own specimens, preferably of different separate dinosaur species, and do our own original research on that. So they started the iDino research project. iDino is the acronym for the investigation of dinosaur intact natural osteotissue. Of course, osteo means bone, so bone tissue from dinosaurs. Now, the scientists involved in this primarily are Dr. Kevin Anderson, PhD in cell biology, And he was also the author of this book, Echoes of the Jurassic, Discoveries of Dinosaur Soft Tissue, which I'd highly recommend. You can type in Creation Research Society on the internet, and their website will come up where you can order this. And also a video. It has many excellent color photographs, such as I've been using tonight. Mark Armitage, very interesting fellow. I like him. Reminds me of Trump, you know. He calls a spade a spade. He doesn't care what anybody thinks, and he doesn't let the opposition give him any guff, you know. That did get him in trouble, though. He was a teacher of microscopy, in other words, microscopic examination of biological tissues and proteins and things like that, at Cal State University, Northridge. And then he published what had been found with the Creation Research Society, a Triceratops supraorbital horn, in other words, one of the horns above the eye sockets. And they found this beautiful soft tissue proteins and exquisitely well-defined osteocyte cells, all kinds of them. He published it in Acta Histochemica, significant biochemical science magazine. Right after that, he got fired for publishing scientific research. Why? Because it seemed to mitigate against evolution. You're not allowed to publish science if it goes against their pet theory. Well, a lawsuit ensued, and he actually won that lawsuit. He proved with emails and other communications that that was the reason they fired him. They had no legitimate reason. He actually won damages of $400,000 from the university. So you can look up his own testimony in that regard. Just type in the name Mark Armitage on YouTube. He also was involved with it, Dr. Brian Thomas. He is not just any biologist. He has a PhD from the University of Liverpool in England, specifically in paleobiochemistry. Paleontology is the study of fossils. So his expertise is right in this area of biochemicals found in fossils. Now, Marge Beisch is an amateur dinosaur hunter, but we owe a lot to her because she's the one who, up in the Hell Creek Formation, not far from Glendive, Montana, found this Triceratops horn that they have examined and published on. Now here she's pointing to where it's found. Notice that less than 2 feet below the surface, not very deeply buried. That means rainwater could get down in there, snow melt could get down in there, and water getting in there makes things, disintegrate even faster than just thermodynamics. So this was very much exposed. Also, it's not deep enough to escape freezing. You'd have a freeze-thaw cycle over years. That'll really destroy proteins. Now here we have part of the exhumation of the dinosaur horn, the Triceratops horn. Here we have it right before they pulled it out. When they pulled it out, they said the bottom was damp. In other words, for sure, water was getting down in there. These are porous rocks with cracks, so you get water in there. It's one of the worst case scenarios. Get bacteria in there, water in there, oxygen in there. The evolutionists say, well, under ideal conditions, it might last millions of years. Well, this is anything but ideal. It's a worst case scenario. And yet they found this exquisite evidence even in this. One thing would explain that. It's only several thousand years old. Now, again, Dr. Kevin Anderson is pointing to where it was found, but notice here, I'll give you this other picture shows it, the face of a cliff. It's right on the edge of the face of a cliff. So it's not only close to the surface of the ground, it's very close to the edge of this cliff, which means from both angles, water would be intruding into it year after year. Again, water should break things down within about 100,000 years if it's constantly exposed. Now, this was the article in Acta Histochemica that was published there by Mark Armitage and by Dr. Anderson. This was the one that got him fired, but they pointed out amazing evidence, also published in this American laboratory. And notice they quote, entire sheets of soft fibrillar bone recovered. So entire sheets of soft, stretchy material with these beautiful osteocyte bone cells embedded within them at different levels. It's just amazing that anything like this could be found in a bone in the worst possible conditions. Now, these were actually published by Mary Schweitzer, and these are osteocyte cells. Notice you can see the individual nucleus in it and little specks called organelles, and these very thin filaments called the filopodia. Very thin, very delicate. These are still soft. They're not mineralized. They're not hard. And that was in T-Rex and the hadrosaur. This is from the dinosaur horn. And again, conditions were not conducive for preservation. There was encroachment of roots, fungal hyphae, bacteria, water, freeze-thaw cycle, everything that should have made it not last very long unless it was only a few thousand years old. Then it might be expected. Notice these beautiful osteocyte cells still in their parallel formation the way they should be. Some have said they actually look so good they look like they're still alive. They are translucent. When you put light behind them, light shines through them. And you see all these delicate filopodia still intact after supposedly 65 million years of being subjected to thermodynamic decay and radiation bombardment. Again, you see the beautiful filopodia filaments there. Now notice all this strands of these filaments here. What's that? That's a lot of collagen protein. There shouldn't be essentially any left after 450,000 years, according to Collins and Buckley, the evolutionists who have done all this research in the thermodynamic breakdown and decay. Well, there it is, a whole bunch of it, supposedly 65 million years old. And here again, you see the translucence. Some claimed, well, these things have been mineralized. Minerals have made them hard as rock. That's why they're still there. Well, he actually put it, you can watch this on YouTube, he put it under a microscope and he compressed the microscope slides. So you could see that it was actually rubbery and flexible. It actually flexed. You would compress it, and then it would pull back out. It would flex out. These are soft. They're not mineralized. And yet they're still beautifully intact after supposedly 65 million years. So Mark Armitage said this kind of preservation is problematic, but for who? For the evolutionists who believe it's much, much older. He said, what mechanism can account for this? Not iron oxides, which would not be a sufficient cross-linkage agent. What mechanism can account for this? Well, again, not iron oxides. What of autolysis, which means automatic breakdown by the second law. Hydrolysis, breakdown by the universal solvent, water. Freeze-thaw, which it certainly would have been subjected to. Infiltration by plants, fungi, insects, microbes. Said we found the DNA of over 35 microbes, insects, plants, mice, etc. This thing was very open to the environment for that to happen. And yet, we still have this beautiful preservation that simply could not have been the case for millions of years. He says, plus it was carbon dated to just 33,000 years. Now, there's a reason why it's not dating to just about 4,000 to 5,000 years since the time of the flood. We'll look at that in a minute. The point is, there should not be anything like that in there. Now, he says, I have a scientific prediction, therefore. We're going to find this in all kinds of fossils, even ones much deeper and supposedly much older. In fact, that has already happened. That prediction has come true. Now, here I quote these world-class authorities, Buckley and Collins, who are archaeologists. And so when they documented how fast collagen breaks down for decades, it was not a problem because they were dealing with archaeological sites that are only supposed to be a few thousand years old. But now you find them in dinosaurs, multiple millions of years old. This is so bad that these two authorities to this day say it can't be real. They deny the reality of it. They said it's some weird anomalous thing that looks like osteocyte cells and red blood cells and soft tissue and blood vessels, because they know jolly well it can't survive very long. They've done the research. They know what they're talking about. But you notice they say it will take between 0.2 and 0.7 million years. That's 200,000 to 700,000 years at 10 degrees Celsius, which is the same as 50 degrees Fahrenheit average temperature, which is what it is here in Montana, by the way, for levels of collagen to fall to just 1% in an optimal burial environment. Optimal meaning no bacterial infestation, no water, and minimal oxygen. So, see, the experiments are done in optimal conditions, and what's the average of 0.2 to 0.7? It's 0.45, or in other words, 450,000 years. Well, that's why they don't accept it as real, even though the evidence obviously shows that it is real. Now, here we have Dr. Brian Thomas, and he did some of this research and displayed it at a major science symposium. And he said he was shocked that only a few came up and raised eyebrows and said, oh, this could be a problem. He said most of them said, oh, yeah, we've heard about that. Mary Schweitzer, showed that these can last millions of years. No big deal, move along, nothing to see here. So they've been propagandized within the evolutionary scientific community to feel, oh, this problem's been solved. No problem at all. Iron from blood. Problem is, many of these now we have documented have no iron. How could that be what makes them last so long when we have clear examples of soft tissue cells, etc., without the iron? Well, what he pointed out here is that the recent studies with the most sophisticated type of spectrometry device, or spectrometry, anyway, the F-tier spectroscope. The F-tier is a acronym, and it showed that when we measure the amount of decay and we plot it with the Arrhenius equations, these are equations that are designed to predict if it's breaking down at this temperature, at this speed, then how much would it break down at a cooler speed and for how long would it survive. And we can actually show these do correlate. These predictions work when we test them over months or even years. Of course, we can't do millions of years worth of experiments, but in the years that we can work for them, so that's why they don't talk about the experiments. But he used the state-of-the-art equipment, the Fourier Transform Infrared Spectroscopy. The acronym is F-tier, so heretofore I'll refer to it as the F-tier spectroscopy device. The state-of-the-art, able to detect breakdown better than anything that we had before, like Buckley and Collins had. They did it a number of years ago now. They didn't have the precision instrumentation we have today. What he documented was that with more precise measurements, we find it's breaking down twice as fast as what Buckley and Collins were able to detect with their older technology. So they said about 450,000 years. This means 225,000 years for thermodynamic decay alone without background radiation, which also would contribute. So it's important to summarize what we've learned here. Dr. Kevin Anderson, in his book, Echoes of the Jurassic, he said, plus many documented examples of preserved tissue and proteins come from fossils in virtually bloodless settings. The preservation of dinosaur and reptile skin, preservation of a chitin protein complex in a beard worm, which by the way comes from the Cambrian, 500 plus million years old, and a sponge, and preservation of protein derivatives in a consortium of algae were certainly not a result of bloodbaths that soaked the biomaterial in hemoglobin. In other words, we have several examples where there is no iron from the environment or from hemoglobin, and yet they're beautifully preserved. So the iron hypothesis has to explain everything, not just something. Obviously, it takes more than iron. One thing that would explain it all, it's only several thousand years old. Again, Dr. Anderson says many of these dinosaur proteins, for example, hemoglobin, myosin, actin, and tropomyosin, are not nearly as structurally resistant to degradation as collagen. In fact, there is no experimental evidence that all these other proteins could survive for more than a fraction of the time that collagen could survive. The best data shows collagen would only survive thermodynamic breakdown for about 225,000 years. All the other weaker ones, much less. And to be in the good shape they're in, only a few thousand years old. He also said in the book, Dinosaur Blood and the Age of the Earth, on page 34, by Fazl Rana of so-called Reasons to Believe Ministries, he says, Rana mentions the ravaging effects of ground radiation and even cites my challenge that no preservation model can counter the effects of radiation exposure over the course of millions of years. Yet, he fails to offer any answer to this problem. So, under pressure, he had to admit, yes, it's a real problem. It's not a made-up thing out of thin air. It's real, and it is a problem. But what's the answer? Neither he nor any other evolutionist has an answer. It's physics. It's radioactive decay. It's inexorable. And the measured amounts should have broken this stuff down within hundreds of thousands of years, not even 1 million years, on that independent basis alone. Believe me, if they had an answer to offer in this book, he would have put it. If any scientist in the world had an answer, he would have quoted them. But they simply don't have it. If you don't remember anything from this presentation tonight, remember that. They have no answer to the problem of degradation by alpha bombardment of ground radiation in the sedimentary rocks. Now, Dr. Anderson also said, other studies also challenge the iron model. Paleontologist Derek Briggs. Now, Derek Briggs is an evolutionist, not a creationist. He cites results of a study where the addition of iron did not slow down the decay of shrimp. It should slow down the decay of any kind of biotissue, whether it's shrimp or anything else, but it didn't. And so we have scientists that have tried what Mary Schweitzer said, and they didn't get the same results. That's a big red flag in science. If you do the same protocol, run the same experiment, you should get the same results. But this evolutionist didn't, and Kevin Anderson also tried to emulate her experiments, didn't get the same results. So this is not very good evidence that they're basing their whole belief on. Now, analysis of the Thescelosaurus vertebrae found iron present in some of the surrounding fossil, but virtually no iron was detected within the preserved tissue, where it's supposed to be. Neither does this model nor any preservation model protect the tissue and proteins from the ravages of ground radiation. So this is like 1-2 strikes and you're out. These are sufficient. Doesn't take 3 strikes. These 2. are enough. The Bible says, out of the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, let everything be established. Worse yet, we have found entire mummified dinosaurs, where they haven't been infiltrated very much at all by minerals. It's still virgin bone, and their intestines are intact, and even the food within their intestines are intact. We can tell what their last meal was, because even that hasn't broken down. It's supposed to be 80 million years old. We look at their intestines, and what do we find? Pine needles. They're eating, conifers with pine needles. They were eating flowering plants. They were eating, what do we got there? Can't quite see that. Ferns, yes. Thank you. Ferns. And leaves from bushes, and even this. Know what that is? Algae. They're eating algae, apparently out of ponds or something. We can actually identify what kind of foods they were eating. That should have all broken down by radiation thermodynamics. These are mummies, which means that they aren't fossilized by minerals. They basically have dried out. They dried out and shriveled. But the proteins, the tissue is intact, it's just dry. We found a lot of these, but the most fantastic one was found up in Alberta, Canada. Anybody hear about it? Well, here it is. In the Oxford edition of Archaeology World, Canada reveals dinosaur mummy found with skin and gut contents intact. But this is really intact. I mean, this looks like a carcass that maybe died a couple months ago. It's amazing. So they say since that lucky moment, it has taken researchers 7,000 hours over the course of the last 6 years to both test the remains and prepare them for display at the Royal Tyrrell Museum up in Alberta. If you get up to Alberta, you can see it yourself. Where visitors now have the chance to see the closest thing to a real-life dinosaur that the world has likely ever seen. Why in the world is it intact? Why are the keratin protein in its horns intact? Why is there skin protein intact in its skin? Why are its intestines intact? Why is it intact at all? Why hasn't it been pulverized into the finest dust, both by thermodynamics and ground radiation? This gives you a scale drawing to show how big it would be compared to a human. This is an ankylosaurus type dinosaur, but this one didn't have a big club in its tail, like the classic ankylosaurs that we have seen. It has a lot of big spikes and horns there, though. That probably is what it used to defend itself. Now, it was found on property owned by the Suncor Oil Company, so they made sure that their name got in the official name of this dinosaur. So it is called the Suncor Boreal-Opelta, and is remarkable for its 3-dimensional preservation of a large articulated dinosaur complete with soft tissue. Notice their admission. While many small dinosaurs have been preserved with traces of soft tissues and skin, in other words, it's a common thing, these are usually flattened and compressed during fossilization. Similar-looking hadrosaurid mummies have a shriveled, desiccated appearance due to their partial mummification prior to fossilization. This is fantastic. 3-dimensional, not very flattened out. All these proteins in the skin, the keratin in its horns, it simply shouldn't be there. It should have been pulverized to the finest dust within a few 100,000 years. How old do they say this is, by the way? 110 million years old. I don't think so. Again, this type of preservation strongly speaks that these things could only be thousands of years old. Now, it's not just dinosaurs, but proteins and soft tissue, things like this have been found in all kinds of fossils, just like Mark Armitage predicted they would be. Yes, they're found in dinosaurs, but also marine reptiles, pterodactyls, birds, insects, lizards, frogs, salamanders, mammals, squid, and fish. Now, not only that, they've been found in the deepest, supposedly oldest layers. We believe all the layers were laid down by the flood, and then as they dried out, cemented, kind of like Portland cement, it dries out and cures, it gets hard as rock. So all of them were buried about the same time at the flood, and therefore none of them are hundreds of millions of years old, even the deepest ones in the so-called Cambrian. But notice chitin, this polysaccharide biochemical, was detected in a sea scorpion fossil dated at 417 million years, in a sponge dated at 505 million years, and in beard worms dated at 551 million years. That's over 500 million years. Okay, the alleged 500 million-year-old beard worms not only retain chitin, but still contain protein mixed within soft, flexible material. After more than 500 million years, I don't think so. If they asked me To believe that, I'd say, well, you're the kind of person I'd like to sell the Brooklyn Bridge to, because you're easily persuaded of something that does not make sense. This simply cannot be true, based on everything we know in real science and the actual experimental results. So we have nothing but failed explanations as to how this soft tissue, cell structure, and distinct proteins can be found in dinosaur bones and even these other ancient fossils. For example, contamination has collapsed. Bacterial film explanation has foundered. Toast theory is toast. And iron from blood has bled out, especially in light of the fact that we find soft tissues with no blood and no iron. It has definitely bled out. They have no viable explanations, even though they claim that they do. Now, there's one other thing that should not be in ancient bones, or wood, or coal, or oil, or anything: carbon-14. Carbon-14 decays with a short half-life compared to, isotopes of uranium and thorium. They have supposedly very long half-lives, although we do have evidence that they decayed very rapidly in the past. We have physical evidence to document that. I won't go into that too much tonight. I have it documented in my DVD back there on Scientific Evidence for Young Age of the Earth. But carbon-14 has a short half-life of only 5,730 years, which means about every 57 centuries, half of it disappears. It decays back into nitrogen-14. Then of the half that's left, half of it disappears the next 57 centuries. So you go just 10 half-lives, less than 60,000 years. It's been cut in half so many times, there's hardly a detectable trace. In fact, you get much past 100,000 years, it's very difficult to detect any atoms at all. And the calculations show that after 250,000 years, there won't be a single atom of carbon-14 that has not decayed back into nitrogen-14. What does that mean? Anything older than 250,000 years shouldn't have any carbon-14 in it, but we find it in everything. Coal, oil, ancient wood, supposedly hundreds of millions of years old. We find it in dinosaur bones all over the place. Every time they're tested for it, the evolutionists don't test it because they assume it can't be in there. But every time we test it, we find it. Now, how does carbon-14 produced? Cosmic rays bombard the upper atmosphere, producing fast-moving neutrons. These neutrons collide with atmospheric nitrogen atoms, producing carbon-14. So it's the cosmic ray bombardment that produces carbon-14 in the atmosphere. Like carbon-14, carbon-14, like ordinary carbon is carbon-12, combines with oxygen to produce carbon dioxide. Vegetation absorbs carbon dioxide during photosynthesis. So some of this radioactive carbon-14, as opposed to carbon-12 dioxide, gets absorbed in the photosynthetic process. It gets into plants, animals eat plants, we eat plants and animals, so it goes down the food chain. We can also breathe it in a bit. Since animals feed on vegetation, it is added to their bodies at present in a ratio of about 1 to 1 trillion. So present ratio is that for every trillion carbon-12 normal carbon atoms in the environment, there's only one carbon-14 atom. So it's a pretty small ratio. However, after death, this ratio will slowly decrease, since while carbon-14 continues to decay, it is not replenished by feeding. The amount of carbon-14 in a dead animal shows how long it has been dead if, and what a big if, one can be sure of the amount of carbon-14 in it when it died. Okay? Since it decays completely within 250,000 years at a maximum, anything that's old like dinosaurs, etc., shouldn't have any in it. We have even found it in diamonds. Nobody thought to look for it in diamonds because they're anywhere from 500 million to a few billion years old, according to evolutionists. It also has the strongest atomic lattice structure of any known substance, naturally occurring substance, in the world. So strong, it seems impervious that carbon-14 could break through that and contaminate the interior of diamonds. But we thought of testing them, and we've tested diamonds from all over the world. They all have very measurable amounts of carbon-14 in them, indicating they can't be billions of years old. Carbon-14 would have decayed completely within 250,000 years. So the fact that it's there is a problem. Now, the reason it always seems to date, usually in the parameters of 20,000 to about 40,000 years for the most, kind of with about a 30,000 some year average, is because they all had about the same carbon-14 in them when they died in the flood. However, we would predict that at the time of the flood, there was not as much carbon-14 in the environment as there is today. Because something else the evolutionists largely ignore, the Earth's magnetic field has been tested around the globe by tracking devices since the 1800s, longer than any other worldwide geophysical phenomenon, and the data shows it is decaying exponentially in a sharp exponential curve with a half-life of only about 1,400 years. That means 1,400 years ago, the Earth's magnetic field was twice as powerful as it is today. 2,800 years ago, it was 4 times as powerful. You get back to the time of the flood, it'd be at least 6 or 7, maybe even 8 times as powerful as it is today. Now what that means is in the 16.5 centuries before the flood, there was not as much carbon-14 being produced because the magnetic field deflects cosmic radiation, doesn't let all of it through. If it's stronger, it deflects more. That means because the field is stronger today, we get much more production of carbon-14 today. But back here, in the 16.5 centuries before the flood, there would have been less. Therefore, these creatures died with carbon-14 in them, but not as much as they would have today. The evolutionists assume the ratio we have today has been the same for millions of years. They don't listen to the decay of the Earth's magnetic field. They certainly don't listen to Genesis as history. And so they assume if there's less than the 1,000,000,000,000 ratio, the only way that could happen is because decay half-lives at about 5,700 centuries each have taken place. And when they measure them out in there, it comes out usually to be between about 20,000 to 40,000 in that range. They all have that. Now their main argument, well, this is contamination. It's contaminated. Well, guess what? The ones near the surface should get the most contamination of modern radiocarbon or carbon-14. The ones deeper down, harder to get at, should have less. The ones way down at the bottom, like at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, they should have the least. But when we drill down and check them, they all have the same parameter, between about 20 to 40,000 years on the average, indicating they all have the same amount, as you'd expect if they got buried in the flood and they all had the same amount of carbon-14 in them. There shouldn't be any in them after 250,000 years, but it's very measurable there. So we find that, gotta hurry up here, every sample of coal, oil, wood, or bone that has been tested for carbon-14 content, even if retrieved from rocks supposedly millions of years old, always contains a measurable amount of carbon-14. That should not be the case. So we found it, again, in these ranges of about 20-some thousand to about 40,000, that we find that all over, no matter whether it's plants, coal, oil, whatever. It always seems to hit in that same range, which is predictable based on limited amount produced before the flood. All these different dinosaurs and wood, we got them in that parameter. Now, radiocarbon in dinosaur bones was actually presented at a major international symposium back in 2012. This was, I believe, in Singapore. And a team of researchers gave a presentation at the 2012 Western Pacific Geophysics meeting in Singapore, August 13 through 17, at which they gave dating results from many bone samples from 8 dinosaur specimens. All gave dates ranging from 22,000 to 39,000 years, right in the ballpark predicted by creationists, based on what we would believe about less carbon-14 being produced before the flood. Now notice, the researchers approached the matter with considerable professionalism, including taking great pains to eliminate contamination with modern carbon as a source of the carbon-14 signal in the bones. The lead presenter was Dr. Thomas Seiler, a German physicist whose PhD is from the Technical University of Munich. The video of his presentation was up on YouTube at the time of the writing of this report. Notice, the researchers seem to be associated with Catholic creationist groups, which I didn't even know there were such things. Maybe they're charismatic Catholics, and which have reported the conference earlier and more vocally than evangelical creationists. One of these reports states that afterwards, quote, the abstract was removed from the conference website by 2 chairmen because they could not accept the findings, unwilling to challenge the data openly. In other words, they'd have to prove, you tell us how it got contaminated. We ruled it out by our protocol. What's the answer? Well, they didn't want to do that because they knew they didn't have any good answer. So they were unwilling to challenge the data openly. They erased the report from public view. In other words, they just censored it. Judge, jury, and executioner. They didn't even ask the AOC officers who they were supposed to be submitted to. They just did it. And as they say, it has never been restored. So you know they don't have good answers when they're so desperate that they subject censorship rather than giving, scientifically valid answers. So again, the soft tissue they claim is just a little gadfly, just a little dust on the scales, but it's really shining light that many of their assumptions cannot be true. And in fact, there's a whole big weight on this side. We have soft tissue that they've not been able to adequately explain, carbon-14 that they can't really explain, rapid decay of radioisotopes such as uranium and thorium, that we have evidence with radiogenic helium that's been out for years now, they haven't been able to refute it, that rapid decay took place no more than 6,000 years ago. Today it is slow. But most of the daughter atoms got there by rapid decay. And that means even radioisotope dating with uranium, thorium, neodymium, samarium, etc., collapsed down to just thousands of years. That's their big, proof that the Earth is millions of years old, and yet even that, we have solid scientific evidence that rapid decay negates that. Also, the origin of life, they've never been explained the origin of the first species. If you can't get the first species, it can't evolve into all the other ones. That's a fatal flaw, not a minor problem. And they're not anywhere close to that. The fossil gaps, Darwin said in his day that the gaps in the fossil record were the most obvious and serious objection to his whole theory. He hoped we'd get much more in the future, but we haven't. It's gotten worse. Those gaps are what you'd expect if creation is true. Also, we have many dinosaur accounts from people around the world, from antiquity even up to present times, where in remote areas they may still be alive. I talk about that in my DVD back there, The Great Dinosaur Deception Exposed, and dinosaur artwork also covered in that. So all this evidence, myriads of different types of tissues, proteins, biochemicals that simply should not be there. This cannot be brushed aside by saying, oh, there was some iron, when we found it now in places where there is no iron at all. They've got to have something better than that. Even if iron was there, it will not negate the inexorable production of radiation bombardment, which should have pulverized these things to the finest dust in just a few 100,000 years. So the points to remember in conclusion: soft tissue and proteins are acknowledged in many scientific publications, over 50 now, as genuine. No experimental data exists showing how these could survive thermodynamic breakdown and ground radiation for millions of years. There is no legitimate explanation of carbon-14 in dinosaur bones or all the other things we found in the fossil record. No refutation of radiogenic helium in basement granitic rocks, the physical smoking gun, the signature showing radioisotope decay of alpha decay isotopes, such as uranium and thorium, was rapid in the past, not slow like it is today. No credible explanation for an evolutionary origin of the first species. If you can't get to first base, you can't run the plates to get to home run. So if they can't get the first species, they can't explain dinosaurs or any other species because they can't get the first one. It has to evolve into everything else, including us. But if you can't get to first base, you've got nothing. No credible explanation for lack of ancestors and transitions, which we have throughout the fossil record, which should not be true. Creation predicts that. Finally, no proof that the biblical account of origins is not therefore superior to the evolutionary narrative. So in conclusion, we find that the dinosaur's blood is telling us a message. You know, that's actually biblical. The Bible says that blood actually speaks. We find this in Genesis. We find it, I believe, in Hebrews, where it says that the blood of Jesus speaketh better things than the blood of Abel. What does it speak? It speaks for mercy and grace and forgiveness because it was a sacrificial shedding of blood by the Creator on behalf of his fallen creation. But it speaks better things than the blood of Abel. Why? Because Abel was murdered. His blood was shed as an act of murder. And therefore his blood cried out to the ground, from the ground, for vengeance. And it told the truth. When God confronted Cain about the murder, he lied. He said, well, how do I know where my brother is? You know, am I my brother's keeper? He knew jolly well he had murdered him. But he lied. But God said, wait, there's a testament that never lies. The testimony of his blood. He said, what have you done? The voice of your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. And that testament is telling the truth about what happened here. The blood speaks, the Bible says. And today we have dinosaur blood crying out from their bones, telling us the truth, that these creatures did not evolve millions of years before man and go extinct 65 million years before man himself evolved, but they have lived within the life and memory and culture of mankind. And the carbon-14, the soft tissues, the proteins, and indeed the blood itself cries out a message that is true, a message that reveals, like the blood of Abel, that Cain was a liar. This reveals the evolutionists are liars. They hate God, they don't want to believe in God themselves, and they don't want you to believe either. Jesus would say of them what he said of the Pharisees, you yourselves refuse to enter the kingdom of God, but you do worse than that. You try to hinder those who are willing to enter. And they try to hinder our children by teaching them lies. That, oh, everything evolved. You don't need to believe in God. Dinosaurs are proof of evolution. Don't believe the Bible. Don't believe there's a creator. The blood cries out against them that they are liars, just as it cried out against the first murderer and liar in history. Okay, In conclusion, Romans 1:20 tells us that for ever since the creation of the world, his invisible nature and attributes, that is, his eternal power and divinity, have been made intelligible and clearly discernible in and through the things that have been made. His handiworks. Dinosaurs are one of his handiworks. They're almost infinitely more complex than a single cell. Yet we know today what Darwin did not know: a single cell is more complex than any machine man has ever created, or really ever dared dream of creating. They can do things none of our machines are capable of doing. So God has his handiworks, including dinosaurs, and their blood is crying out from their bones, telling us the truth against the lies of the evolutionists. They were created recently. They did not evolve over millions of years. So these men are without excuse and altogether without any defense or justification. Well, I appreciate your patience. I've gone just a few minutes over. I do have this available, the same presentation I did tonight, back in the DVD table under this title. If you have any questions, I'll be glad to field them back there because of the lateness of the hour. John, if you want to come forward and close this out with a word of prayer, thank you so much for your attention tonight.
Well, hopefully you guys got all that, right?